corpus.
All right. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for having me. I haven't been to ICAAL in a while, but I'm glad to be here. And this is kind of an exploratory study. So I'm looking for feedback and other discussion. I'll mainly focus on identifying kind of what I'm talking about in terms of reconstruction, what the data kind of looks like from a top-down view, and whether that's even really viable. So just to get into some preliminaries here, what does it mean to reconstruct syntax? I'm essentially interested in developing hypotheses about protoforms. So what syntactic patterns were or maybe are grammatical. And this matters because we want to understand history. We want to understand the interaction between groups. We want to understand how language changes. And if we can understand how language changes and identify patterns in those changes, we can actually make universal claims about how the brain processes language. So this is kind of what I'm interested in. Now, when I'm talking about syntactic reconstruction, there are certain parallels to phonological reconstruction. When we're doing phonological reconstruction, we're comparing words. In syntax, we're comparing morphemes and word combinations. In both cases, we're looking at kind of form-meaning pairings. And it's mainly that the scope of investigation is a bit broader with syntactic reconstruction, which adds a bit more complexity. With phonological reconstruction, we are reconstructing based on systematic sound correspondences versus kind of the functions or the uses that you would find in syntactic constructions. In phonological reconstruction, we then can form hypotheses regarding the phonology of a language, whereas with syntax, we're looking at hypotheses regarding syntactic patterns or allowed syntactic patterns. Now, the benefit is that thanks to phonological reconstructions, we already know that languages are related. So that part of the picture is done for us. And so when we observe similarities across languages that we know are related, we can surmise that these are not due to chance. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. Obviously, some things are due to chance, right? So how do you separate those things out? That's one of the difficulties. But we can assume that regular patterns in syntax that are consistent are also meaningful. So how do we actually reconstruct syntax? There are kind of two approaches that you could take. I favor a bottom-up approach where you start with extant languages that are available, and then you try and identify correspondences and hypothesize about protoforms. And that's typically the tack that's taken in phonological reconstruction. But there's also possibility, if you have a historical language to compare with, to do some kind of top-down analysis. And the assumption here when you're doing a bottom-up reconstruction is that the found structures in those related languages represent these potential branch or family patterns, and then you account for variation in those patterns. Now, what are your comparanda? What are the things that you're actually comparing? In the case of syntax, I would argue that these are constructions. So these are any kind of syntactic form or meaning pairing. The fact that you can combine any syntactic form or meaning pairing means that there's a lot of complexity, right? Or potential complexity. Now, some examples of this would be noun phrases. Can you reconstruct a particular noun phrase in terms of what's allowed in the noun phrase for each language, and then what the proto-language would have allowed? Attributives, so what morphemes or structures are allowed, and then things like the order of arguments or predicates, word order, in what contexts are certain combinations allowed. And that's kind of what I'm interested in trying to reconstruct. Here, when we're reconstructing syntax, we have to kind of define the terms that we're using. And I would say a construction, in this sense, is a surface level phenomena. So things that you can observe, the observed production of meaningful units, which implies things are linear, one thing follows another. There is components, so things combine together to form larger structures. That also implies hierarchy, so there's some dependency relations. And there is also some implication of function. So these particular constructions are used for a particular purpose. Now, since we're looking at syntax, what are the criteria that then allow us to compare these syntactic structures? And I would say if we're looking at any grammatical surface structure involving multiple morphemes, that constitutes a syntactic comparison, but they have to share some properties. So they have to be comparable in some way. And the more shared properties there are, the more potential there is for reconstruction. So this kind of follows on some work that I've been doing with Matthias at University of Zurich many years ago, starting to get back into it. But this was a chart that we developed for that. And this refers to the potential for reconstruction. So in a given set of languages, we have a client of representativeness and of concreteness. And concreteness refers to how iconic or accessible the information is in that construction. The more concrete it is, and then the more representative it is, meaning it's represented in all the languages that you're working on or trying to compare, the more likely it is to be reconstructable to the parent language. Okay, so an example in the Cassian context would be the verb for eat is bam, and there's a first singular marker that we might reconstruct as o. If this combination of verb and subject or verb and argument occur in this particular order, then it's more likely to be reconstructable from the related languages to the proto-language. Okay. In terms of being abstract, we could also say if a verb is often followed by a noun or most often followed by a noun in the extant languages that we have, then we could probably reconstruct that larger larger construction to the proto-language. So that's just a more concrete example. Now, what kind of data can we use for this kind of analysis or investigation? I'm looking at different kinds of naturalistic data. I think this is kind of the best data that we could use for reconstruction. But this falls into three different categories that I've identified. One is random data. So for multiple domains, you've got recordings and transcriptions of, say, folktales, of activities, of conversation, and you're trying to compare across those, okay? Another kind of data that's also naturalistic would be parallel data. So this is data from the same domain that's gathered on multiple languages. And related to that is more targeted data. So you're trying to get data focused on particular constructions, either through experiments or through other means. So like the pair story, for example, might be a good way of targeting certain constructions, okay? So what are we doing with Austroasiatic? So this is part of a larger project that I've kind of begun on the back of our verb initial project at Zurich. And this is looking at data from a data set called the Tagged Parallel Bible Corpus. So there's a lot of languages represented here, and I thought I'd just look specifically at the Austroasiatic languages. Now I'll go through kind of some of the caveats here, and then give an overview of the syntactic patterns that I've found related to Austroasiatic and other languages, and then make some observations. But this data set is open, and you're welcome to visit this link here and contribute if you can, and I'll make a larger appeal for that later on. So what is the tagged PBC? This is Bible translations from nearly 2,000 languages, so 1,943, I think, at the last count. More than 150 language families. And most of the corpora over 1,800 of the corpora are represented by 1,885 verses. So this is a lot of parallel data. Now, in order to develop, say, part of speech tags for these languages, I use some automated tools to transfer information from English using translation. This is not necessarily the best way of doing it, but it gives us a baseline. And I've found that the word order that you can derive from these corpora actually correlates with typological databases, so expert determinations of word order for World Atlas of Language Structures, GramBank, and Autotype. Those are expert determinations that for things like subject and verb order, for intransitive clauses, or subject, verb, and object word order for transitive clauses. And the correlations are actually quite striking. So I think it's a good baseline to start with. This is kind of what the data looks like. It's annotated in this format, so you have kind of word level annotation, but you can see that there's a lot of actual missing data, and there's some automatic transfer of glossing and part of speech, but it's not as precise as I'd like it to be for all languages. But if we look at, say, word order patterns, okay, in the 1,198 languages from typological databases, so this is word order that's been determined by experts for those languages, you can compare that with word order proportions. So here we have verb initial proportions, verb medial proportions, verb final proportions. And the observation here is that all languages have some degree of variation in the word orders that you can find, okay, in a given corpora or given corpus. So verb initial languages show this pattern where you have a lot more verb initial sentences than verb medial or verb final in relation to verb medial languages. So you can see verb medial languages have the most verb medial sentences, and verb final languages have the most verb final sentences, if you look at, counting across these corpora. Okay, so that's the observation from all, 1,200 of these languages or so. So across all languages, there's variation. There's no exclusively subject-verb or verb-subject language. There's always some variation. And yet we can find these correlations with word order classification. Now, Austroasiatic languages are also variable, and we can observe tendencies toward particular orders. And one question we can ask is, how meaningful is this? If we take an overview of, say, Botnaric languages. Based on this corpus, we find that most of them have a verb medial profile if we compare with the 1,200 languages overall. But there's a few languages like Central Lunang and Tre which have a much higher proportion of verb initial structures based, again, on this corpus. And then if we look at, say, Katuic, it's mostly verb medial. We do have some Eastern Brew looks a little bit verb final. In Kasi and Palang, mostly, again, verb medial, but we have some interesting increases in the verb initial proportions. And you can notice this data set doesn't include Panar or Wa or War. So that is because those don't have Bible translations. Okay, so again, this is strictly based on analysis of Bible translations through kind of automatic part of speech tag transfer. Central Khmer, Northern Khmer look pretty verb medial. Brai in Khmuic looks somewhat verb final, verb medial. Okay, and then Mon is pretty much verb final, as are the Munda languages. Nicobaric is clearly verb initial. And then we have Vietic, which looks very verb medial. Okay, so this is kind of the overview that you can get from a top-down perspective. So let's take a look now at the Botnaric comparison for two languages that seem to have a verb initial profile. Okay. One nice thing that you can do with a data set like this is to extract individual verses. Okay, and this will illustrate kind of the need for more and better annotation for this data set. So here you have Acts 5 verse 40 taken from this parallel Bible corpus, and you can see that our automated tool has been able to identify adverbs and verbs, but it's not clear to me how accurate these identifications are. Okay, but here, according to this, automated system, automated way of getting parts of speech, we do find a verb occurring initially in this particular construction. And so someone who is more well-versed in Central Manong can correct me on the annotations here. I'm not a specialist in Batnaric by any means. Okay, we can also look at Hre, okay? And here you see that there's a lot more kind of unknown part of speech tags. The only thing that this particular tool was able to identify clearly was this word, which I don't even know if that's accurate. Okay, so this means that for some of the verses, the identification of parts of speech is going to be lacking. And so the question is, how much information can we actually gather from this? If we have better annotation, we can extract more information. And we can look at particular constructions that occur. And that's where we want to marry kind of the top-down approach, which allows us to observe these general tendencies, with a more bottom-up approach, which allows us to compare verses in this parallel corpus with each other for a particular group of languages, identify potential corresponding constructions. Since they're parallel verses, that shouldn't be as difficult, and then see if we can reconstruct alternates or possibilities for the proto-language in terms of syntax. So this brings me to kind of my final slides. And I have a bunch of questions, right? What clause types should be investigated? What does variation mean? How are these particular constructions related? How do we get from the diversity of syntax and syntactic expression to a kind of proto stage, which may also have diversity? What can we actually say about reconstructing syntax? So is it helpful to do this kind of top-down oriented approach? I think it at least allows us to kind of get some insight into potential areas for further investigation. But we also probably need other data, other approaches, and then we need to be able to account for when we can't find correspondences between individual languages. So I would like to continue expanding this data set to other languages, maybe expand beyond Bible translations, incorporate data from other sources, and mainly to get better and more accurate tags for each language, so that we can actually compare apples to apples rather than to oranges, and look at ways of kind of mapping more complex dependencies as well. So if you'd like to collaborate, please check out this link. It gives you some ideas for contributing, either through manual annotation or otherwise, and I'd be happy to work with you if you are interested in this project. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hiram, for this interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Now we can take some questions. I don't see any questions yet. Oh, okay. Let me see. Geoffrey Benjamin, I think, has a question.
Yeah, Hiram, that was very interesting. Have you noticed any interference between where the translation has come from? I mean, are these made from the original Greek or from various European languages? And I would suspect that maybe some of the idioms a bit stilted in a biblical translation and not quite as naturalistic as you might wish it to be?
So again, I'm not a specialist in most of these languages. It's hard to be a specialist in 2,000 languages, but most of these are from the International Bible Society, the sources. And from what I understand, most of them are translated from the Greek. So they would share a lot of those kind of similar constructions. I think there's probably a bit of variation, but people who I spoke to who do Bible translation have told me that that the emphasis in the last 50 years, 30 years has been on translating things naturally into the target language, which in some cases means that the verses don't always line up. Mm-hmm. So in the target language, you might have, one 20 sentence or 20 word verse that corresponds to 3 or 4 verses in the English translation. So that's definitely, an issue that I need to address with specific languages, for sure. Yeah, in terms of other things, I'm not aware of any particular issues, but I haven't looked at all 2,000 of the languages individually. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Ryan has a question in the chat. Does the database contain a combination of hand-annotated, interlinearized data and machine-annotated data?
No, it doesn't. So this is all based on the Parallel Bible corpus, which was developed by Michael Sisau and Mayer. I'm trying to remember his first name, but they basically made the data available. None of it has been kind of manually interlinearized. So what I did was I took the English verses and I paired them with the target language verses, and then I developed a machine translator using that parallel text for each pair of languages. So roughly 2,000 machine translation models that then were able to annotate manually all of that data. And when there was a direct kind of correspondence between a target language word and the English word, I would transfer the information from the English word in terms of part of speech and such. So there are other issues with the data set in the sense that grammatical features that don't exist in English but exist in the target language just don't show up. Now, I've made some adjustments that I'm hoping to push up to the database for. There are about 160 languages in the universal dependencies tree banks, which have been manually annotated. And so I've trained part of speech taggers based on the data in there, so the gold standard data, and then retagged the 160 or so languages that are also present in the Parallel Bible corpus. And so that data is better annotated, but still not as good as I would like.
Okay, thanks. We have another question in the chat. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you. In regards to the top-down model, in languages that are highly topicalized or show different word order patterns, I was wondering if the bottom-up model would be beneficial in understanding them better.
I think so. I think the benefit of working from a bottom-up approach is, especially if you're a specialist in that language family, you can more clearly identify what are the common patterns, right? And so you're kind of working from the ground up. So I think really the bottom-up approach is the best way to do reconstruction. The top-down kind of just gives you general observations that you can hopefully use to kind of guide your bottom-up approach.
Okay, I don't see any other question, but I have a question myself, or actually two related questions about the Kmoik slide. It was about Prai, right? were those only transitive clauses or also involving intransitive clauses?
Let's see.
Graphs for
yeah. So this is across all clause types. So transitive and intransitive both.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me because I've worked quite a bit on PRAI, and there are a lot of verb initial structures in intransitive clauses. So that's why I was shocked by the like zero kind of.
Yeah. Well, and again, you know, if I look directly at the PRAI Bible translation, it might be the similar situation to you know, what we found in Botnaric, where there's a lot of missing data. You know, so if somehow I could get better annotations for PRAI, this whole, you know, analysis might change. And so that's kind of, you know, why I'd like to annotate these further. And not just with Austroasiatic, but with all of these languages. I think there's a lot of potential for getting really interesting information from this data set if it were annotated properly. And I really wish I had access to like back translations of a lot of this this Bible data, because that would give me much clearer indications of what are nouns and what are verbs and what are pronouns and things like that. So.
And just one more question: why is there no CMU in there? I was just wondering.
Oh, because
translation.
Well, so I don't have one for some reason. Okay. I couldn't find a CMU translation in the available data online, but I'll look for it and I'll see if I can add it here. Yeah.
And Ryan has one more question: were any of the results of your Austroasiatic survey surprising based on what has been documented in the literature?
I was surprised that I didn't find more verb initial structures, honestly, because that was one of the things that we discovered in our Zurich, you know, work, was that there were surprisingly a lot of verb initial structures that were not identified. And so I think one of the issues with this particular investigation is that it's constrained to this particular kind of data in Bibles, and there's maybe not as accurate annotation as could be. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. We maybe still have time for one more question. No. Okay. Otherwise, we can thank one more time our speaker and get ready for the next presentation. Thank you, Hiram.
Thank you.